New York City, the 1940s. A place of opportunity for some, a place of survival for others. In the working-class neighborhoods of the Bronx and later East New York, Brooklyn, a boy named John Joseph Gotti Jr. was growing up in a world where power wasn't given, it was taken. The fifth of 13 children in a household ruled by poverty, Gotti learned early that the world was unforgiving. His father, John Sr., was a day laborer, barely able to put food on the table. The boy watched as his father struggled, as his mother did her best to hold the family together. And somewhere in his young mind, a decision was made. He would never be weak, and he would never be poor. By the time John Gotti was 12 years old, he had already found his way into the streets. The schools, the lessons, the rules, none of it interested him. What did interest him were the men who commanded respect, who walked into neighborhood bars and restaurants with an air of authority, men whose names carried weight. They were gangsters, and they didn't wait in line for anything. They didn't live like his father. They lived by their own rules, and John Gotti wanted that life. It wasn't long before he was running with local street gangs, skipping school, getting into fights, and dabbling in petty crime. He learned how to steal, how to intimidate, how to earn money without breaking his back at some dead-end job. By his mid-teens, he had already been arrested multiple times. But arrests didn't scare him. They were a badge of honor, a sign that he was playing the game the right way. His name was beginning to circulate, not in classrooms or among teachers, but in police stations and among the men who ran the underworld. But there was one incident that almost changed everything. At the age of 14, Gotti and his gang attempted to steal a cement mixer from a construction site. It seemed like an easy score, until it went wrong. The heavy machinery toppled over, crushing his foot. The injury left him with a permanent limp, a reminder that even the toughest men weren't invincible. But if anything, the pain only hardened him. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let a bad break change his path. If anything, it convinced him that he needed to be smarter, more ruthless. He needed to climb higher. By the early 1960s, John Gotti had found his way into organized crime, running errands for Carmine Fatico, a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. The Gambinos were one of the 5 families of the New York Mafia, and they controlled rackets that stretched from the docks to the nightclubs, from construction unions to drug operations. Gotti wasn't just some street thug anymore. He was part of something bigger, something powerful. And under the watchful eye of Agnello Della Croce, the Gambino underboss, Gotti was learning what it took to make it in the Mafia: loyalty, fearlessness, silence. He proved himself quickly, hijacking trucks at JFK Airport, shaking down business owners, running protection rackets. Gotti thrived in the chaos. He had a temper, a short fuse that made him dangerous, but he also had an undeniable charm. He could be violent when needed, but he could also talk his way out of situations most men wouldn't survive. And people listened when he spoke. They followed him. He was building a reputation, one that would one day make him infamous. But reputation came with risk. In 1968, Gotti's ambition landed him behind bars. After leading a crew that hijacked a truck filled with merchandise, the law finally caught up with him. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It was his first real taste of the justice system, but it wouldn't be his last. And when he walked out of prison in 1971, he wasn't just some soldier anymore. He was a man on a mission. A man who saw himself as something greater than a common street thug. A man who was already setting his sights on the throne of the Gambino family. John Gotti had taken his first steps into the world of the Mafia. But for him, being a soldier wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted power. He wanted respect. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. By the time John Gotti walked out of prison in 1971, he had lost time but gained something far more valuable: status. He wasn't just another street enforcer anymore. He had served his time, proven his loyalty, and now he was ready to climb even higher. The streets of New York had changed while he was away, but one thing remained the same: power belonged to those who were ruthless enough to take it. Gotti immediately resumed work under Carmine Fatico, a powerful captain in the Gambino family. His job was simple: control the crew, enforce orders, and make sure the money kept flowing. But there was one man who took a special interest in him: Agnello Della Croce, the underboss of the Gambino family. Della Croce wasn't just another mobster, he was old school, a man who lived by the code of omertà, a true believer in the traditions of La Cosa Nostra, and he saw something in John Gotti. Something dangerous, something useful. Della Croce became more than just a superior, he became a mentor, teaching Gotti the deeper rules of the Mafia. Respect is earned in blood, he told him. Loyalty is everything, and never ever forget, fear is stronger than love. Gotti absorbed these lessons like gospel. He wasn't just a street thug anymore, he was becoming something more, something bigger. In 1973, Gotti's loyalty was put to the test. James McBratney, an Irish-American gangster, had made a fatal mistake. He had kidnapped and killed a Gambino family member. That kind of disrespect could not be tolerated. The order came down from above. McBratney had to go. Gotti, eager to prove himself, took the job without hesitation. On May 22, 1973, inside Snoop's bar in Staten Island, John Gotti and two associates walked in, posing as detectives. Their plan was simple: grab McBratney, get him outside, and execute him. But the plan went sideways. A struggle broke out, and instead of waiting, Gotti pulled the trigger inside the bar, shooting McBratney in front of witnesses. The message was sent, but it was sloppy, and sloppy work got attention. The police quickly pieced together the crime, and within months, Gotti was arrested and charged with murder. But in the world of the Mafia, justice was different. Gotti took a plea deal, accepting a lesser charge of attempted manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, a small price to pay for proving his loyalty to the Gambino family. And just like before, prison didn't break him, it only made him stronger. By the time Gotti was released in 1977, the landscape of the Gambino family had changed. Paul Castellano, a businessman-like figure with little taste for street violence, had taken over as boss. He preferred discretion, money laundering, and political influence. But the old-school faction, led by Della Croce, believed in the traditional ways: respect, honor, and violence when necessary. And Gotti, he was firmly on Della Croce's side. Gotti was now a made man, officially inducted into the Gambino crime family. He was given his own crew, operating out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. From this small clubhouse, he ran everything: loan sharking, gambling, extortion, hijackings. And unlike Castellano, Gotti kept his hands dirty. He didn't just give orders, he enforced them himself. His reputation grew. He was charismatic, brutal, and most importantly, he got results. His crew made millions, and Della Croce took notice. But power brought problems. Gotti's appetite for control, his flashy lifestyle, and his growing influence put him on a collision course with the very man at the top, Paul Castellano. And in the Mafia, when tensions rise, blood is the only way they're settled. John Gotti wasn't just another gangster anymore. He was a force, and soon the entire underworld would know his name. By the mid-1980s, the Gambino crime family was sitting at the top of the Mafia world. They controlled labor unions, extorted businesses, and ran illegal rackets that brought in millions. But behind the scenes, a silent war was brewing. At the heart of it were two men: Paul Castellano, the boss who ran the family like a corporation, and John Gotti, the streetwise underboss-in-waiting, who believed Castellano was unfit to lead. Paul Castellano had never been a street enforcer. He preferred boardroom deals over bloody executions. He spent more time in his $5 million Staten Island mansion, White House, than in the trenches with his soldiers. He wanted to modernize the Mafia, move away from drug dealing, and focus on white-collar crimes. But Gotti and his crew didn't care about Castellano's vision. They were making millions from heroin trafficking, and they weren't about to stop just because the boss said so. Tensions between Gotti and Castellano reached a breaking point in 1985. Castellano had become increasingly paranoid, suspicious of Gotti's growing power and defiance. When authorities arrested several members of Gotti's crew on drug charges, Castellano saw an opportunity. He began discussing eliminating Gotti. To Castellano, Gotti was reckless, uncontrollable, and worst of all, dangerous. The Mafia had a rule: if the boss ordered your death, you had no choice but to accept it. But Gotti wasn't a man who followed orders, he gave them. With his life on the line, Gotti made his decision. If Castellano wanted him dead, he'd strike first. And so behind closed doors, a coup was planned. Gotti, along with key allies including Frank DeCicco and Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, carefully orchestrated one of the most audacious hits in Mafia history. They knew the rules. Killing a boss without permission from the other families was a death sentence. But Gotti didn't care about rules. He was playing for the highest stakes, complete control of the Gambino empire. December 16, 1985. The cold New York air carried a sense of finality. Paul Castellano and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti, were on their way to Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. As their black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the restaurant, 4 gunmen, disguised in trench coats and fur hats, moved into position. They waited for the signal. Gotti himself, parked nearby, watching from a dark sedan. The doors opened. Castellano stepped out first. 6 shots rang out, tearing through his body before he could even register what was happening. He collapsed onto the cold pavement, his blood pooling around him. Bilotti, caught in the chaos, barely had time to react before another barrage of bullets riddled his body. In less than a minute, the Gambino boss and his right-hand man were dead, executed in broad daylight on a Manhattan sidewalk. And John Gotti? He watched it all unfold, making sure the job was done before calmly driving away. The Mafia world was in shock. A boss had been assassinated without the approval of the commission, the governing body of the 5 families. It was an unthinkable act, a violation of the old ways. But Gotti didn't care. He wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in power. And within days, he made his move. At a secret gathering, he declared himself the new boss of the Gambino family. No vote, no discussions, just a simple fact: he was in charge now. The newspapers quickly picked up on the story. The FBI knew Gotti was behind the hit, but proving it was another matter. There were no witnesses willing to talk, no evidence tying him directly to the murder. The streets buzzed with his name. He had done the impossible, removed a sitting boss and taken his place without immediate consequences. It was a move that made him a legend. It was a move that made him untouchable. Or so he thought. John Gotti had just rewritten the rules of the Mafia, but in doing so, he had placed a target on his back. And in the world of organized crime, even legends don't stay untouchable forever. With Paul Castellano dead and his own rise to power complete, John Gotti became the undisputed boss of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful of New York's 5 families. But Gotti wasn't just any Mafia boss. He was something different. He wasn't content to operate from the shadows like his predecessors. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be admired. And soon he would become the most famous gangster in America. Gotti's leadership style was unlike anything the Mafia had ever seen. While bosses like Castellano had kept a low profile, avoiding unnecessary attention, Gotti embraced the spotlight. He dressed in $2,000 Brioni suits, dined in the best restaurants, and paraded through the streets of New York like royalty. The media couldn't get enough of him. He became a tabloid sensation, a real-life gangster who looked like he had stepped out of a Hollywood film. They called him the Dapper Don, and he loved it. But it wasn't just his style that made headlines. It was his ability to evade the law. The FBI had been after Gotti for years, and now that he was the boss, they ramped up their efforts. Undercover agents, wiretaps, surveillance. Every move he made was being watched. But time and time again, the charges never stuck. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence went missing. Jurors were bribed or intimidated. And after every acquittal, Gotti walked out of the courtroom with a smile, waving to the cameras like a celebrity. The newspapers gave him a new nickname, the Teflon Don. Nothing could touch him. His first major courtroom victory came in 1986. The FBI had built a strong racketeering case against him, linking him to multiple crimes, including loan sharking and extortion. But the trial turned into a spectacle. Gotti walked in every day like a movie star, flashing his signature smirk. Jurors were mysteriously reluctant to convict. And when the verdict was announced, not guilty, Gotti walked out onto the courthouse steps, grinning as cameras flashed around him. He had humiliated the FBI. He had defied the government. He was invincible. And that was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Gotti beat case after case. In 1987, another trial ended in an acquittal. In 1989, yet another case fell apart. To the public, he wasn't just a criminal, he was an outlaw folk hero. To the Mafia, he was a king who ruled with an iron fist. His underlings feared and respected him. His enemies knew that crossing him meant death, and the FBI, they were furious. They knew he was guilty. They knew he was ordering murders, running illegal rackets, corrupting unions, but they couldn't prove it, at least not yet. But with power came arrogance. Gotti believed he was truly untouchable. He openly mocked the FBI, ridiculed prosecutors, and even laughed at his own trials. He held extravagant parties, walked freely through the streets of Little Italy, and welcomed the attention that other mobsters feared. He wasn't just running the Gambino crime family, he was becoming a cultural icon. But inside the Gambino family, not everyone was loyal. Gotti's leadership style, his constant media exposure, and his reckless arrogance were making enemies. The old-school mobsters resented his flashy ways, and even within his inner circle, there were whispers of discontent. One man in particular was watching closely, a man who would ultimately bring down the Teflon Don. John Gotti had spent years dodging bullets, outmaneuvering the law, and solidifying his reputation as the most powerful gangster in America. But in his quest for fame and invincibility, he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the people closest to him, and soon, his empire would begin to crack. For years, John Gotti ruled the streets of New York with an iron fist. His enemies feared him, the media adored him, and the law couldn't touch him. But what Gotti failed to see, what all men blinded by power failed to see, was that no empire lasts forever. And in the shadows, forces were already moving against him. The FBI was tired of losing. They had watched Gotti humiliate them time and time again, slipping through their fingers like a ghost. But the problem wasn't just Gotti, it was the old methods. The government had been fighting the Mafia the same way for decades, relying on weak informants and flimsy evidence. That approach had failed. It was time for something new, something bigger, something that even John Gotti couldn't escape. The plan was simple: take away his invisibility. Gotti had survived for so long because the government couldn't connect him directly to his crimes. That was about to change. The FBI placed hidden microphones in the places Gotti felt safest: his social club, his car, even inside his own headquarters. And as the recordings started coming in, the agents couldn't believe what they were hearing. Gotti, confident that he was invincible, spoke openly about murder, racketeering, and betrayal. He criticized his own men, mocked his enemies, and gave direct orders for hits. He didn't realize that every word he spoke was being recorded. And among those listening, one man in particular was paying close attention: Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. For years, Gravano had been Gotti's most loyal lieutenant, his right-hand man. He had personally carried out Gotti's orders, overseeing murders, extortion, and the family's daily operations. But now, sitting in FBI custody, Gravano listened to the tapes of Gotti badmouthing him behind closed doors. He heard his boss call him greedy, ungrateful, and even imply that he might be expendable. That was all it took. Gravano made a decision that would shake the Mafia to its core. He would turn informant. When the FBI announced that Gravano had flipped, the Mafia world was in shock. No high-ranking Gambino underboss had ever betrayed the family like this. Gravano knew everything, and worse, he was willing to talk. Over the next few months, he detailed every crime the Gambino family had committed under Gotti's rule. He provided evidence for dozens of murders, racketeering operations, and the assassination of Paul Castellano. With his testimony, the government finally had what they needed: an airtight case against John Gotti. In December 1990, the FBI made its move. Gotti was arrested outside the Ravenite social club in Little Italy, the same place he had once held court like a king. This time, there were no smiling reporters, no flashy suits, no arrogant smirks. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings were damning, and Sammy the Bull was about to seal his fate. For years, John Gotti had laughed at the law, mocking the very idea that anyone could bring him down. But in the end, it wasn't a rival gangster or a hail of bullets that ended his reign. It was something far more powerful: his own words. And now, the man who once thought he was untouchable was about to face the trial of his life. March 1992. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn was packed. Reporters lined the streets, cameras flashed, and spectators gathered for what was being called the trial of the century. This wasn't just another mob case. This was John Gotti, the Teflon Don, the man who had laughed in the face of justice for years. But this time, no amount of money, intimidation, or bribery could save him. The evidence was overwhelming, and the man who once ruled the streets like a king now sat shackled in a courtroom, waiting for his empire to collapse. The prosecution was relentless. Led by Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, they came armed with the most powerful weapon the government had ever used against the Mafia: tapes. Wiretaps from the Ravenite Social Club, secret recordings from Gotti's own headquarters, and hours of conversations that proved beyond a doubt that he was guilty. The jury listened as Gotti casually discussed murder, racketeering, and the inner workings of the Gambino family. They heard him order hits, insult his own men, and boast about his power. And they heard his greatest betrayal, the words that turned Sammy, the Bull Gravano, against him. Gravano's testimony was devastating. The former Gambino underboss had spent years at Gotti's side, carrying out his orders and enforcing his will. Now, he sat just feet away, looking his former boss in the eye as he laid out every detail of the crimes they had committed together. He told the jury about the assassination of Paul Castellano, the extortion rackets, the murders, the payoffs, the corruption. He admitted to killing 19 men himself, but there was one key difference. He had cut a deal. In exchange for his testimony, the government would reduce his sentence. He would walk free one day. Gotti would not. For the first time in his life, John Gotti was powerless. He couldn't intimidate the jury. He couldn't threaten the judge. His usual tricks, bribing witnesses, tampering with evidence, buying his way out, were useless. The case against him was airtight, and the jurors knew it. They had been secretly sequestered, protected from the mob's influence, their identities hidden to prevent intimidation. For years, Gotti had relied on fear to keep his empire intact, but now fear was working against him. April 2nd, 1992, the verdict was announced: guilty, on all counts: murder, racketeering, loan sharking, obstruction of justice. The list went on. The Teflon Don had finally been caught. The courtroom erupted, prosecutors shook hands, reporters rushed to break the story. Outside, FBI agents celebrated, and inside, John Gotti sat motionless, his legendary smirk finally gone. He had spent years defying the odds, escaping the law, and living like a king. But now his empire had crumbled. He was no longer untouchable. He was just another convicted criminal, sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. As he was led away in chains, the city that had once worshipped him watched in silence. The man who had once waved to crowds from courthouse steps, the man who had strutted through Little Italy like a god, was now headed for a tiny prison cell. The reign of John Gotti was over, and with it, an era of the American Mafia came to an end. For John Gotti, the days of silk suits, fine dining, and public adoration were over. The man who had once ruled the streets of New York now found himself in a world he could not control. A world of steel bars, concrete walls, and the relentless monotony of a prison sentence that had no end. Sentenced to life without parole, Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure federal prisons in the country. It was a place designed for men like him, men who could never be free again. The adjustment was brutal. In the outside world, Gotti had lived like royalty. He had been the face of the Gambino crime family, a symbol of power and defiance. Inside prison, none of that mattered. He was just another inmate, stripped of his status, his influence reduced to whispers through prison walls. Worse, he was placed in solitary confinement, locked away for 23 hours a day in an 8-by-10-foot cell. For a man used to commanding armies, it was the ultimate humiliation. The once vibrant figure who had strutted through New York like a king now paced alone in a cage, his only audience the guards who watched his every move. But even in prison, Gotti refused to surrender. He still saw himself as the boss, still tried to exert control over the Gambino family from behind bars. He used coded messages, smuggled letters, and visiting relatives to pass orders back to the streets. He still had loyalists, men who revered him, men who would do anything to keep his legacy alive. But the world outside was changing. The Mafia wasn't what it used to be. The FBI had cracked down harder than ever, and without Gotti's iron grip, the Gambino family began to fracture. The new leadership struggled. Infighting erupted, federal pressure increased, One by one, Gotti's old allies were arrested, flipped, or killed. The Mafia code of silence, the very foundation of organized crime, had been shattered. In the past, mobsters would rather die than betray their brothers. But Gotti's downfall had set a new precedent. The younger generation of gangsters saw no honor in life behind bars. They saw only self-preservation. And as the years passed, more and more of them chose to talk. The very thing Gotti had built his empire on, loyalty, was disintegrating. As his power waned, so did his health. Years of stress, isolation, and prison life took their toll. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. The once mighty boss, who had stared down prosecutors and laughed in the face of the law, was now fighting a battle he could not win. He was transferred to a medical facility for treatment, but the disease was relentless. Radiation therapy weakened him, his body withered, and the fire that had once defined him began to fade. By 2002, he was barely recognizable, the dapper Don reduced to a frail, sickly shadow of his former self. In his final days, there were no grand gestures, no public displays of defiance. The cameras that had once followed his every move were gone. The men who had once sworn loyalty to him had either died, disappeared, or betrayed him. And on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, John Gotti died alone in a prison hospital, surrounded not by family, not by friends, but by the silence of a life that had finally caught up to him. The funeral was quiet. Unlike the grand send-offs of Mafia legends before him, there were no citywide processions, no massive gatherings of mourners. The authorities restricted everything. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens alongside other Gambino family members, but there were no grand tributes, no monuments, just a simple grave for a man who had once thought himself immortal. The reign of John Gotti had come to an end, not in a blaze of glory, not in a dramatic showdown, but in a prison cell. His empire crumbled, his legend fading. The Teflon Don had finally met the one enemy he could never escape: time. John Gotti was dead, but his name refused to disappear. Even in death, he remained one of the most infamous figures in American crime history. His story, ruthless ambition, unchecked arrogance, and a spectacular downfall, was the stuff of legend. But what was his true legacy? What had he left behind? For some, Gotti was a symbol of old-school mafia power, a man who took what he wanted and refused to bow to anyone. To his supporters, he was a rebel, a modern-day outlaw who defied the system and lived life on his own terms. Even in prison, he had refused to cooperate, never once considering the path of betrayal. In that sense, he had died the way he lived, defiant to the end. But for others, Gotti represented the beginning of the end for the American Mafia. His arrogance, his need for attention, his public persona, it had all been a fatal mistake. The Mafia was never meant to operate in the spotlight. The old bosses had understood this. They kept their power in the shadows, avoiding unnecessary attention. Gotti did the opposite. He welcomed the cameras, courted the media, and became a celebrity. And in doing so, he brought the full force of law enforcement down on his own organization. The FBI's war on the Mafia didn't stop with Gotti. After his fall, the Gambino crime family, once the most powerful of New York's 5 families, began to crumble. Without strong leadership, the organization fractured. New bosses came and went, but none could reclaim the dominance that Gotti had once wielded. The government had learned its lessons. RICO laws, wiretaps, informants, all the tools that had brought down Gotti were now being used to dismantle the Mafia as a whole. The era of the untouchable mob boss was over. And then there was the matter of family, the people closest to him. Gotti had always claimed that family was everything, yet the life he had chosen had torn his own apart. His son, John Gotti Jr., followed in his footsteps, rising within the Gambino family ranks. But his reign was short-lived. After multiple arrests and prosecutions, he eventually walked away from the life, choosing a different path. His brother, Peter Gotti, took over the organization but lacked the charisma and ruthlessness needed to keep it together. The Gotti name, once feared, was now a relic of a bygone era. Outside of the underworld, Gotti's story became entertainment. Hollywood seized on his legend. Books, documentaries, and films depicted his rise and fall, each retelling adding to the myth of the Dapper Don. But beyond the glamour, the reality was far less romantic. Gotti's life had ended in a prison hospital, that alone and powerless. His empire had collapsed. His closest allies had either betrayed him or been buried, and the Mafia, the institution he had once ruled, was in decline. So, what was John Gotti's true legacy? Was he a fearless leader who lived by the code of the streets? Or was he the architect of his own downfall, the man who destroyed the very thing he claimed to protect? Perhaps he was both, a king who had built his throne on violence and loyalty, only to see it all turn to dust. One thing was certain: there would never be another John Gotti. The world had changed, the Mafia had changed, and the age of the larger-than-life mob boss, the man who walked the streets like a god, had ended with him. With John Gotti's death in 2002, the last true Mafia superstar was gone. But the world he had once ruled, the world of organized crime, did not simply vanish. The Gambino family still existed, as did the other 4 families of New York's Cosa Nostra. However, they were no longer the powerful, untouchable organizations they had been in their heyday. The government's war on the Mafia had been relentless, and Gotti's downfall had only accelerated its decline. In the years following Gotti's imprisonment, the FBI and federal prosecutors continued dismantling what was left of the American Mafia. Longtime traditions like omerta, the sacred code of silence, were crumbling. The rise of RICO laws had turned many made men into government informants. What once would have been an unthinkable betrayal now became a survival strategy. The days of iron-fisted bosses who commanded absolute loyalty were over. The Gambino family struggled to maintain its power. After Gotti's imprisonment, his brother Peter took over, but he lacked the intelligence and presence to hold the organization together. Under his weak leadership, the family lost influence, their rackets shrinking, their power fading. By the early 2000s, the Gambinos, once the most powerful crime family in America, were just another criminal enterprise, struggling to stay relevant in a changing world. But it wasn't just the Gambinos who suffered. The entire structure of the Mafia had been exposed and weakened. Law enforcement had perfected the use of wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover informants. The old ways of doing business, secret meetings in social clubs, coded conversations, unbreakable loyalty, were no longer effective. The Mafia was bleeding, and there was no one left who could stop it. Even the public perception of the mob had shifted. In the past, men like Gotti had been seen as figures of power and charisma, dangerous but fascinating. Movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas had romanticized the life of a gangster. But by the early 2000s, the reality was clear. The Mafia was no longer an empire. It was a crumbling relic. The new generation of criminals wasn't interested in tradition or loyalty. They were interested in profit, and they had no problem betraying their bosses if it meant saving themselves. As law enforcement continued to break down the organization, the Mafia adapted, retreating further into the shadows. No longer did bosses flaunt their wealth or seek media attention as Gotti had. The few who remained in power learned from his mistakes. They operated quietly, avoiding the spotlight, ensuring that their names never made headlines. The Mafia still existed, but it was nothing like the empire John Gotti had once led. In many ways, Gotti's rise and fall marked the turning point for organized crime in America. He had embodied both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness, the ability to command loyalty, but also the arrogance to believe he was untouchable. In the end, his own mistakes, his obsession with fame, and his disregard for the old ways had sealed his fate, and with him, the golden age of the Mafia had ended. There would be no more Teflon Dons, no more public trials that captivated the nation, no more crime bosses walking the streets like kings. John Gotti's story was the last of its kind, a cautionary tale of power, ambition, and the inevitable fall that follows those who believe they are above the law. John Gotti's story is one of power, betrayal, and ultimate downfall. He lived by the code of the streets, rising from a small-time hustler to the head of America's most powerful crime family. He defied the law, outmaneuvered prosecutors, and became a larger-than-life figure in the public eye. But in the end, his arrogance proved to be his greatest weakness. No man is truly untouchable, not even the Teflon Don. His reign brought fame, fortune, and fear, but it also led to his destruction. The very qualities that made him legendary, his defiance, his pride, his desire to be seen as invincible, became the weapons used against him. He thought he could outplay the government, outlast his enemies, and maintain his grip on power forever. But history tells a different story. The Gambino empire crumbled, the Mafia's influence faded, and Gotti himself spent his final days locked away, powerless, forgotten by the very world he once ruled. So what can we learn from John Gotti's rise and fall? Perhaps it's that no empire lasts forever. No man, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of his actions. The streets may remember his name, but they also remember his mistakes. In the end, the Teflon Don wasn't untouchable. He was just another man who flew too close to the sun. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most gripping true crime stories, legendary rises and epic falls, and the hidden truths behind history's most notorious figures. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you want to see more stories like this, let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.